On Sunday, Bulgaria went to the polls for its 8th election in barely 5 years. In the past 7 elections, no party has won more than 30% of the vote, giving way to a series of unstable, unwieldy, and ultimately short-lived coalitions. This time, however, there was a clear winner. Former President Rumen Radev, whose newly created Progressive Bulgaria party won an astonishing 45% of the popular vote, which translated to an outright majority in parliament. So in this video, we're going to take another look at Bulgaria's multi-year political crisis, how Sunday's election finally broke the impasse, and what Radev's election means for Europe and Ukraine. We've heard a lot of talk about Europe de-risking or decoupling from the US recently, so in the latest edition of our magazine, we thought we'd discuss whether this is actually feasible, and why Europe could still struggle without US backing. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So to understand Radev's meteoric rise, you need to know a bit about the chaos that preceded him. Since 2009, the largest party in the Bulgarian parliament has usually been the centre-right Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria, or GERB party. GERB is led by Boyko Borisov, the former mayor of Sofia and personal guard of Todor Zhykov, who effectively ruled Bulgaria from 1954 until 1989. Despite originally running on an anti-corruption platform, Borisov proved to be quite corrupt himself, but hung on to power for the following decade or so due to a lack of a viable opposition. However, after a series of corruption scandals, in 2020 the country was engulfed by a massive wave of anti-government and anti-mafia protests, demanding Borisov's resignation. Protesters also called for the resignation of the country's chief prosecutor, seen by many Bulgarians as a leading defender of the mafia, and the prosecution of Borisov's longtime ally, Delian Pevsky, a Bulgarian oligarch and media mogul who was sanctioned in 2021 by the US under the Magnitsky Act, with the UK following suit 2 years later. Anyway, these mass protests eventually forced a snap election for April 2021, where Borisov and his GERB party lost vote share to a number of new anti-corruption and reformist parties. No one won anywhere near enough seats to form a government, however, which forced another snap election that July. The same thing happened again, so there was another election in November. Even though the vote was, once again, very fractured, with no party winning more than 25%, the reformist and left-wing parties decided they couldn't subject the electorate to yet another election, and so ploughed on with an unwieldy 4-party coalition. Barely a few months later, however, Russia invaded Ukraine, triggering a massive energy crisis in Europe. Bulgaria, which is one of the EU's poorest countries, was hit hard, and this new coalition struggled to cope. Things quickly fell apart, and fresh elections were called for October 2022. This time, GERB returned as the largest party, but were unable to form a government because, well, no one else wanted to govern alongside them. This led to another election in April 2023, but this time the two sides were able to work out an agreement and formed a rotational government. Many reformist voters were annoyed that the anti-corruption parties had decided to work with Borisov, and, somewhat unsurprisingly, 9 months later, the coalition collapsed. After 2 more elections, in January 2025, Borisov's GERB party were finally able to scrape together a coalition without the reformists, leaning on the former communist and pro-Russian Bulgarian Socialist Party, the populist There Is Such a People party, and a faction of Pevsky's party. Although it's worth mentioning that another GERB MP, Rosen Zakelievskov, ended up becoming Prime Minister instead of Borisov. GERB's return gave way to a sense of disillusionment amongst Bulgaria's reformist bloc, and created a pervasive sense, especially amongst young people and more liberal-minded Bulgarians, that Bulgaria's politics had essentially broken beyond repair. However, late last year, the GERB government introduced a controversial draft budget for 2026, which, in large part because Borisov had made some expensive promises during the last election campaign, would have significantly raised taxes on working people. This triggered widespread protests, and the government promptly announced they would withdraw the budget, but went back on this decision a few days later. This triggered even more protests, which were supported by the vast majority of Bulgarians. The government did then properly withdraw the budget, but it was too little too late, and in December Zakelievskov resigned, triggering yet another election, which was held on Sunday. Originally it looked like Bulgaria was headed for more of the same. When Zakelievskov resigned, GERB were actually falling in the polls, and no party was polling on more than 25%. However, in late January, Bulgaria's president Ruman Radev, a former pilot who had been in post since 2017, announced that he would be resigning in order to run in the parliamentary election via a new party called Progressive Bulgaria. For context, the president is usually a relatively ceremonial figure, but in the past couple of years, Radev has become increasingly prominent, both because no prime minister has really been able to establish themselves, and because the president is responsible for appointing and dismissing ministers, which has been happening pretty frequently. This has allowed Radev to sort of float above the political chaos, presenting himself as a beacon of relative stability, and Progressive Bulgaria immediately shot up to the top of the polls. Radev's party actually ended up dramatically outperforming the polls. As of Monday morning, with 97% of votes counted, Progressive Bulgaria are on an astonishing 45% of the vote. Under Bulgaria's electoral system, which is relatively proportionate, but has a 4% vote threshold that slightly advantages larger parties, this translates to 131 seats in the 240-seat parliament. One of the big reasons that Radev outperformed the polls is that he was able to enthuse voters who had previously given up on the electoral process. You can see this if you just look at turnout. Turnout trended downwards between 2021 and 2024, going from about 40% to more like 30%, but spiked up to nearly 50% on Sunday, presumably because new voters turned out for Radev, seeing him as their best chance to restore some normalcy. So, what does Radev mean for Bulgaria and the EU? Well, domestically, Radev has made it clear that his priority is rooting out corruption and fixing the Bulgarian state. To this end, he signalled an openness to work with other reformist parties in parliament. In terms of foreign policy, Radev is often described in the international press as pro-Russian, and sometimes even framed as a sort of Orban regen. We should say, we think this is too strong. While it's true that Radev was originally very hesitant to support Ukraine after Putin's full-scale invasion in February 2022, refusing the provision of military aid and resisting the imposition of sanctions, he's become more sympathetic to Ukraine in the years since, meeting with Zelensky and publicly condemning Russian aggression, and has generally fallen in line with the European mainstream when he's attended previous European Council meetings. More recently, Radev has argued that Ukraine should sue for peace, and that Europe should aspire to, quote, practical relations with Russia. But he's also made it clear that his priority is maintaining good relations with the rest of Europe, and looks unlikely to obstruct European efforts to support Ukraine, especially given Bulgaria's dependence on EU funding. Keeping up to date with stories like these and doing independent journalism requires a lot of constant research across all corners of the internet, and even sometimes calls for international travel. But it's not uncommon that we come across roadblocks, whether that be dubious-looking websites that claim to be safe, dodgy Wi-Fi connections in airports and cafes, or even region-locked articles. We couldn't get by any of these barriers without a trusted VPN. So that's where NordVPN comes into play. That's because NordVPN not only offers you the fastest VPN on the planet, giving you quick and secure streaming wherever you are, but it also keeps you fully safe from all the suspicious corners of the internet. NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro feature is built to protect you by blocking dangerous ads, stopping you from entering malware hosting websites, and running thorough checks on everything you download. If anything is found to be infected and dangerous, the files are removed before they can harm you. But if you're rightfully concerned about your life before NordVPN, they've got you covered. Their dark web monitor will be constantly scanning the seedy underbelly of the internet even when you're not connected to a VPN, and will alert you if any of your old data or passwords have been sold. From there, NordPass will give your old passwords a huge upgrade and keep them all in one place for you to easily and safely manage. In today's world, we couldn't imagine even just existing on the internet without a VPN, so there's no better time to take your internet safety seriously. If your online safety is as important to you as it is to us, simply sign up to NordVPN today. Click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR, and not only will you get a massive discount, but you also get 4 extra months totally free. There's no better time to protect yourself. So once again, that's nordvpn.com/TLDR, and it's completely risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee.